Good evening, everyone. As you can see, this evening Keshava is here with us, so we're going to take advantage of his presence and have a nice long session of chanting before we start talking about the Bhagavad Gita. So let's begin with a prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, friend, beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, beloved Master Paramahansa Yogananda, saints of all religions, friend and guide Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. Help us to live according to thy guidance, to feel your loving presence ever in our hearts, to be inspired in all that we do by the light of your love. Om. Peace. Amen. So we'll chant, we'll meditate for a couple of minutes, and then we'll have our class.
With thine own hands light the lamp of thy love. In my house with thine own hands light the lamp of thy love. Thy transmuting lamp entrancing, thy transmuting lamp entrancing, wondrous are its rays. Change my darkness to thy light, Lord, change my darkness to thy light, and my evil into good. Touch me but once, and I will change. Touch me but once, and I will change all my clay into thy gold. All the sense lamps that I did light, sooted into worries, sitting at the door of my soul, sitting at the door of my soul. Light thy resurrecting lamp in my house with thine own hands. Light the lamp of thy love in my house with thine own hands. Light the lamp of thy love. Thy transmuting lamp entrancing, thy transmuting lamp entrancing, wondrous are its rays. Change my darkness to thy light, Lord, change my darkness to thy light, and my evil into good. Touch me but once, and I will change. Touch me but once, and I will change all my clay into thy gold. All the sense lamps that I did light, sooted into worry, sitting at the door of my soul, sitting at the door of my soul. Light thy resurrecting lamp in my house with thine own hands. Light the lamp of thy love in my house with thine own hands. Light the lamp of thy love. Thy transmuting lamp entrancing, thy transmuting lamp entrancing, wondrous are its rays. Change my darkness to thy light, Lord, change my darkness to thy light, and my evil into good. Touch me but once, and I will change. Touch me but once, and I will change all my clay into thy gold. All the sun's lamps that I did light, sooted into worry, sitting at the door of my soul, sitting at the door of my soul. Light thy resurrecting lamp in my house with thine own hands. Light the lamp of thy love in my house with thine own hands. Light the lamp of thy love, thy transmuting lamp entrancing, thy transmuting lamp entrancing. Wondrous are its rays. Change my darkness to thy light, Lord. Change my darkness to thy light, and my evil into good. Touch me but once, and I will change. Touch me but once, and I will change all my clay into thy gold. All the sun's lamps that I did light, sooted into worry, sitting at the door of my soul, sitting at the door of my soul. Light thy resurrecting lamp in my house with thine own hands. Light the lamp of thy love in my house with thine own hands. Light the lamp of thy love, thy transmuting lamp entrancing, thy transmuting lamp entrancing. Wondrous are its rays. Change my darkness to thy light, Lord. Change my darkness to thy light, and my evil into good. Touch me but once, and I will change. Touch me but once, and I will change all my clay into thy gold. All the sun's lamps that I did light, sooted into worry, sitting at the door of my soul, sitting at the door of my soul. Light thy resurrecting lamp in my house with thine own hands. Light the lamp of thy love. In the temple of silence, in the temple of peace, in the temple of silence, in the temple of peace, I will meet thee, I will touch thee, I will love thee, and coax thee to my altar of peace, and coax thee, I will touch thee, I will love thee, and coax thee to my altar of bliss, and coax thee to my altar of bliss. In the temple of silence, in the temple of peace, in the temple of silence, in the temple of peace, I will meet thee, I will touch thee, I will love thee, and coax thee to my altar of peace, and coax thee to my altar of peace. In the temple of samadhi, in the temple of bliss, in the temple of samadhi, in the temple of bliss, I will meet thee, I will touch thee, I will love thee, and coax thee to my altar of bliss, and coax thee to my altar of bliss, and coax thee to my altar of bliss, and coax thee to my altar
Om, peace. Amen. Well, that was a treat. I should also say that this is November 30th of 2021, and I'm going to take the month of December off. So our next class will be January 4th. For those of you who follow every week, those of you who just pick these up when you can, it won't make any difference, but I thought you would want to know. Okay, we are in the chapter of this book called The True Yoga, which is Swami's chapters. And we are in chapter 6 of the Gita, stanza number 12. And this is a section where Krishna is actually giving instruction for how to meditate, not instruction for the practice themselves, but in general for the where to sit, how to sit, so on like that. So he says, seated firmly there with one-pointed concentration of the mind, and neither roaming mentally nor reacting to sense stimuli, let him seek self-purification by yoga practice, using the techniques prescribed by his guru. I'm beginning to chuckle. One-pointed concentration, neither roaming mentally nor reacting to sense stimuli. Sure, Krishna, let's just do that. That doesn't sound like any problem. Let's just go ahead and do it. Let him seek self-purification by yoga practice, using the techniques prescribed by his guru. Now, of course, he's giving us real instruction here. I love this. Let him seek self-purification by yoga practice. It's just like, what does that mean by yoga practice? I think what purifies us is when we are able to neutralize the vrittis. The vrittis are the whirlpools of feeling that are stored in the chakras. And the vrittis draw our life force into cul-de-sacs of self-preoccupation. I like this, I don't like this, I'm worried about that, I desire this, I'm resentful, I'm angry, I'm sad, I'm, just all the different things. We get some central point of egoic concern, and then in one incarnation over many lifetimes, we build up a whirling vortex of energy around that central concern, and all of that keeps us from being able to sit still, concentrating one-pointedly, the mind agitated by nothing. Patanjali says that the definition of yoga's chitta vritti nirod, yoga is the neutralization of the vrittis of feeling. And so the self-purification that we do when we're meditating, whether or not we're actually one-pointed in our concentration, mind neither roaming nor distracted by anything, if you make any effort to pull yourself in that direction, the way I've always thought about this for many years is if a swing is moving wildly or if a rock is rolling down the hill, you might not be able to stop it just by saying stop, but the effort that you make, the best image always is if you're riding a horse, which is how often the senses are described as horses. When you see Krishna, images of Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita, the Mahabharata, you often see him driving the chariot for Arjuna, and he has the reins of the 5 horses in front of him, which is the 5 senses. He's got the reins in his hands, and he's directing where those horses are going to go. But thinking of us as an individual, if you're riding on a horse, the horse has a bit, a metal bit, which is in his mouth and is against his tongue, and it's a little bit sensitive. It doesn't necessarily hurt the horse, but he can feel it. Because it's there, he can feel it. So if you want him to turn or to stop or to go forward, you play with the reins, which affect the bit. And then there's a phrase called the horse gets the bit in his teeth, which is he gets it off his tongue and he closes his teeth over it. And then it doesn't matter how you pull, it doesn't disturb him, he doesn't feel it. And the horse who gets the bit in his teeth can then just run wild with you. So the image there is when the vrittis get control of our consciousness, then the horse just runs wild. It gets the bit in its teeth, and no matter what our higher self is trying to do, we can't stop it. But even if you're on a runaway horse, you have to start trying to get mastery again, and you start pulling on those reins, and you start trying to work the bit loose from where the horse is holding it. And your first efforts don't necessarily bring any immediate results, but your ultimate capacity to master that runaway horse begins with the first efforts, which may seem impotent in themselves, but they are the foundation for when you eventually get control. So even if we can't sit, as Krishna is saying to do, if we put ourselves with that intention, and then we understand we're undergoing the process of self-purification by the practice of yoga, which is instead of just letting myself be battered and taken wherever my inclinations take me, I'm going to do my best to stand strong here. And even if I am not successful in my first efforts, gradually you begin to weaken the hold that those vrittis have on us. The vrittis, they seem all-powerful, and they do have a tremendous effect on us, but they're only a pattern of energy. This is one of the most important ideas to just sort of take deeply into yourself, so that we can really understand what it is that's going on here. We are nothing but a pattern of energy. That which you think of as yourself, your personality, your inclinations, your weaknesses, your strengths, it's just a pattern of energy. There's nothing permanent about it. And that's why the image of the whirlpool is such a good one, because if you've ever been to a river, the water just runs, and it runs in all sorts of patterns, but all of those patterns can be shifted in an instant if another pattern comes and reforms it. Water is the second chakra, and it's a very marvelous concept, the second chakra energy of water. When I would give classes about the chakras and sort of try to explain people, the first chakra is the earth element and things are solid, but the second chakra is the water element. I say it like that because actually even here I'm holding a cup of water in my hand, but it's not clear. The cup isn't clear. But when you look at it, the water, you look right through the water and what you see is the cup. And the water that I'm holding in this cup is shaped like a cup, because that's what's holding it. I'm not going to do it, but if I poured the water out onto the rug, the water would be shaped like a rug. In other words, there's no form to it. It assumes the form of wherever it is. So when we think about ourselves, we think of ourselves as a fixed form, because the body changes. The body is completely mutable. Dr. Peter tells us that every 7 years, every cell in your body is a new cell. So that even what you think of as your body, it's just constantly mutating. And think of what you were when you were a little child and what you are now, what you are before puberty comes and what happens to you after puberty. Now I'm at the stage where, the strength that I had when I was younger, I don't have anymore. We were, just before we went on camera, we were talking about living up at Ananda village where we all had wood stoves and the efforts we would make to chop wood. And when I was there as a woman in my 20s, every year some of the men in the community would help us, and we'd have this big wood chopping day, and we'd have these wood splitters and just move, hundreds of pounds of wood for the winter. And I was a very strong person. I would do all that sort of thing. I couldn't do it at all now. I'm my same self, but the body has shifted. The material thing is now something else. So what all this is about is an energy pattern is easily shifted. All it takes is energy that's just a little bit stronger going in another direction. And also, when you think of an energy pattern such as an inclination, let's say, to anger, to over-sensuality, to alcoholism, to romance, whatever it might be, it's not one consistent force. There's a power at the center, but it has a periphery to it too. So it's not like we have to overcome it all at once. It's that we nibble at the edges. And even you starve it. It's like this is what you've built up in the past, but you can start feeding another energy over here. I had an inclination to be so, this and so, but now I consistently meditate and I put my attention at the spiritual eye. My commitment to myself in that light begins to draw energy away from other commitments that you had. This energy, the way we think of it, the river image, when you concentrate at the spiritual eye and work for self-purification according to yoga practice using the techniques your guru has given you. What happens is the river itself becomes stronger and stronger. So according to the way the chakras work, at each of the chakras, these vrittis are stored. But if you have a river running and water is captured in a pattern over here because of a tree trunk or a rock or whatever it might be, when that river goes into flood, all of those whirlpools are just absorbed. They're just disappeared because the flow of the river, the main flow of the river, is simply stronger. So every time we meditate, especially when we meditate with the attention at the spiritual eye, which is the guiding force to all the chakras, and if you do yogic techniques like Kriya, or others that your guru may have taught you that are like that, which interiorize and intensify this flow of energy up and down the spine, then every time it goes through the chakras, whatever vritti is there that has less magnetism to pull this way compared to the energy that's now pulling upward, then that vritti begins to dissolve. And it either is shrunk and therefore has less power, or it's just completely absorbed. And this is why when we start meditating, and people will notice this, you may not feel like very much is happening. And you may even feel, I'm not a very good meditator. My mind is not one-pointed. My thoughts are still roaming. But you're on the back of the horse. The horse has the bit in its teeth, and you've begun to try to take command. And even a little, well, this is where it comes from, even a little practice of this inward religion will save you from dire fears and colossal sufferings because it begins to reverse it. And what also happens is when you begin to make this effort, you connect yourself to the grace of God. So every little effort on your part, now you're flowing with the river of grace. It's like the divine is just there waiting to help us, but we have to open the doorway to that energy. But it's always there. So as soon as we open the doorway, it just floods into us. So people will start meditating, start practicing yoga, start doing something that is intensifying and interiorizing and elevating that energy, and they'll just suddenly discover that they're different. I mean, we will discover that we're different. Just things that used to interest us don't interest us. Reactions that we used to have to circumstances, we suddenly notice we're just not reacting that way. Realities that we were blind to before, suddenly they're simply obvious to us. And you don't even know, this has been my experience, you don't even know when the change took place. Because what happened is the river has gradually been absorbing those vrittis. So for a long time, you were always giving energy to those vrittis. And they were always spinning and pulling a big piece of your consciousness into whatever that reality is. I have to have this, I'm afraid of this, this is what I really want, I never want this to happen. But it's just a pattern of energy. It's just a habit that we've built up that has created a pattern of energy that I think of as myself. It's my karma. But the practice of yoga changes your karma. And it changes your karma because it changes the energy pattern. What that means also, you have to understand, is that we can just become a completely different person. I remember humorously, I was in New York City with Swamiji sometime in the late 70s. I don't know, anyway, it was around it, somewhere in there. And we went to, I don't know if we were the guests in the home of we were either staying there or we just went there for dinner or something. And it was this couple. And at that time, my job at Ananda Village, or a little prior to that, was that I ran the community kitchen. I ran the kitchen for several years. This couple had come to visit, and they had been there for a number of weeks, and they often worked with me in the kitchen. Now, in between, Swami gave me the spiritual name Asha, so my name did change. But I was with them, and Swami introduced me and so on. And I said, oh yes, we worked together when you were at the retreat. You worked with me in the kitchen. We worked together a lot. No, they said that was someone else. I said, actually, it was me. We were the ones, we did that. No, that wasn't you. And I think I was going for the third time to tell them that it was me, and then I decided just to accept what they were saying. Yeah, that was someone else. And same body, same memory pattern. But if they were so convinced that I wasn't the same person, why would I insist? And it wasn't untrue. Because, just I threw myself into the spiritual life, and by the grace of God, I was becoming somebody else. You just change over and over and over again. Apparently the Dalai Lama said, if you're going to measure your spiritual progress, he said you must never think of increments less than a decade. Which I thought that was very interesting, actually, because we tend to think of a week or a month or something like that, and if we don't get results, we get really impatient. But he said for the real transformation of spiritual practice to take place, you have to look at a decade, which is really fun to do, especially if you had a decade on the spiritual path, because you think about who you were 10 years ago, if you've been a serious sadhaka, and you can see. I'm just like the way I was then, I could never be that way now. It's not like I'm straining not to be that way. It's just I couldn't be that way. That person has literally, their energy pattern has completely dissolved. A new energy pattern has replaced it. So anyway, this is what Krishna is telling us. Self-purification by yoga practice. Chapter 6, stanza 13. Holding the spine, neck, and head firmly erect and motionless, let the yogi focus his gaze at the starting point of the nose, between the two eyebrows, and let him not gaze elsewhere, but keep his gaze calmly one-pointed. So Krishna is giving us basic instruction to focus at the spiritual eye. Apparently there has been some controversy about what the starting point of the nose, because sometimes it would say the end of the nose or the front of the nose, but Swami translated it so you would know. Sri Yukteswar commented in Autobiography of a Yogi, the idea that you should gaze at the tip of your nose, the farthest tip. He said the spiritual path is confusing enough without trying to do it cross-eyed. I mean, sometimes people just get so caught up in the details that they lose their common sense. That's why Swami says the origin point of the nose, which is where the nose extends from the forehead, which happens to be the chakra. This is the 6th chakra. And when you understand the esoterica of the physiology of spirituality, you realize that this is the point where the human consciousness meets the divine consciousness. The way we think about it is all of the chakras can be guided from here. The 6th chakra is the medulla and the spiritual eye. These are the opposite poles of the same chakra. One of the things that Yogananda added into the study of yoga was an understanding of the reality of the medulla. And it's a wonderful explanation of the way our consciousness works, the way he talks about it. Master defines ego as the soul, the jiva is a better word, which is our divine individuality. The jiva identified with a limited body. And that body is the causal body, the astral body, and the physical body. All three of those bodies. There's an element of ego as long as we're identified to all three. Of course, the causal ego is a very light touch, the astral less so. The material ego is the most forceful, the identification with the physical body. And that word identification is so subtle because we have to operate the physical body. Swami writes elsewhere in these sections, he says even a self-realized master has to have enough ego to keep the atoms of his body together. Otherwise, there has to be a certain life force directed to hold this body in this form. So the master has to identify enough with the body to hold the atoms in place, else the body would dissolve. This is also after death, when Sri Yukteswar resurrected in front of Yogananda, after he'd been dead for quite some time. And he appeared before Yogananda, and this is talked about in great detail in Autobiography of a Yogi, not in a vision, but in an actual physical body. That Sri Yukteswar just used his will to bring physical atoms back together in the same pattern to make a body that Yogananda could recognize. And in that chapter, The Resurrection of Sri Yukteswar, Master talks about kneeling at Sri Yukteswar's feet, feeling the firmness of his toes through his shoes, that all the years that Yogananda lived with Sri Yukteswar, he often knelt at his feet, and he was very familiar with the feeling of those toes, and that those toes were actually there. And Sri Yukteswar said, yes, this is an exact replica. I just pulled the physical atoms together again. Now, we're doing all that too. You know, our ego identification with this physical body generates the magnetism which holds these atoms in place. And as long as the jiva is committed to this, the atoms will be held in place, the life force will be there, but we're not aware that we're doing it. And we're not able to rearrange the pattern of these atoms. And we're not able to hold off death by our willpower yet. We're not able to do it yet. But it's still all within our grasp, and a great deal of the healing methods that Master recommended were simply strengthening our awareness of the degree to which this body is manifesting according to our will. The energization exercises in which we draw life force, you know, by a conscious act of will, we increase and direct the life force flowing through this physical body. But what we're training is we're training our will to direct life force. And that's the beginning of a greater identification and tremendous freedom. In the physical body, Master says, the seat of ego is here at the medulla, and this is the jiva identified with the physical body. The point between the eyebrows is the jiva identified with the Christ spirit within us, which is to say, with our infinite nature rather than our limited nature. And so the whole of the spiritual path is to shift our self-definition and what we identify with from this limited ego to the infinite. And that's so we're concentrating here. And even the way you look, the way it's described here, head and shoulders, neck straight, and so on like that. And we're gazing here. And then Swami in the commentary goes on to describe it even more exactly all that this means. It's the two eyes of the physical world become united in the single eye of spirit, which is what Jesus says in the Bible. If thine eye be single, your whole body will be full of light. And it's a direct reference to the two physical eyes close, and what appears before us is this radiant light form, which is a golden ring and a dark blue field, and if we see it clearly enough, a white star in the center. The star is the single eye that we're looking into, and it's like the whites of the eye, the iris, and then the pupil is what we're looking at. But we don't look at it by crossing our eyes. We look at it by elevating our gaze just above the horizon line and just reaching out, like Swami says, you put your thumb out and you look at your thumb with your two eyes, and the 2 points of your eye meet at a very comfortable place. You look at one spot just above the horizon line, because the position of the eyes is also closely related to the state of consciousness. If you've ever watched little children fall asleep or pets fall asleep, their eyes drop. I jokingly say, as a public speaker, I get to watch adults fall asleep, which most people don't get to do. And the eyes drop. And then you try to pull them like this. When we're going to sleep, your eyes fall, and you fall into subconsciousness. You lose connection with this world, you go into subconsciousness. When we're awake, we're more or less just looking straight out. This is sort of the plane of the physical world. And then when we're inspired, we always look up. And it isn't just a question of, oh, I'm practicing yoga and I'm looking at the spiritual eye. If you notice yourself and others, when you're trying to remember something, you stop for a moment and you think, what was that I was supposed to do? Or, oh, I remembered the fragment of song I heard. Or, I had a wonderful dream the other day. Your eyes automatically go up because you're going up into the realm of superconsciousness where inspiration comes from us, comes to us, from which inspiration comes to us. And so when we're meditating, if you watch your own meditation practice, if you find that your mind is wandering, especially if you find that you're just sort of wandering around in a sort of semi-dream state, your eyes have always dropped. And one of the most effective ways just to bring yourself back is just to raise them up again. If you keep them raised, the focus of necessity is that way. And then the mind will wander, it'll pull the eyes down, and then you bring it back up again. But the other part of it, which is actually sort of interesting to think about, we tend to rest at the medulla. We just kind of rest in our sense of self. But resting in the medulla, we're looking up. We think of the vision as coming from our eyes, but it's actually coming from the medulla. So the medulla is offering itself into the spiritual eye, which is the ego is offering itself into a higher level of individuality than this self-concerned entity that I'm following. These are all wonderful things that you can experiment when you're trying to focus and make your meditation practice more dynamic. This is what we're trying to do, and it's right here. I mean, this scripture is, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years old. Nothing has changed. You sit in an upright position, you look at the spiritual eye, and you work to dissolve the vrittis, to purify yourself from the impurities of wrong thinking that have taken over our consciousness, and we act according to what the Guru told us. There it is. I mean, what did you learn yesterday in your meditation class? You learned exactly what Krishna said to us here. I mean, the Bhagavad Gita, for that reason, and for many others, is truly amazing. It's just nothing changes. We think that we're so modern, and just the ways in which we're modern are trivial compared to the ways in which we are eternal, and nothing has ever changed. So, chapter 6, verse number 14. Serene and fearless. Krishna is describing to us what this state of meditation is. Serene and fearless. Steadfast in his vow of brahmacharya, sexual control. His mind controlled and his attention centered in me. The seated yogi should meditate on me as the ultimate goal of all striving. Swami now goes, a natural question which anyone asks who will read this, is sexual abstinence a requirement for the practice of yoga? I had a very funny experience many years ago when I was traveling in the Northwest. This was in the early 80s before I took up residence here. And I was giving classes just in a public setting, drawing people together to follow this path. And there were these two young women. As it happened, they were from Europe, I think. They were sisters. And they just sort of became wildly enthusiastic about what I was doing. Sometimes people are enthusiastic in a certain way that I just wait for the other shoe to drop. But in any case, as it happened with these two girls, And they were coming. I was there for, I don't know, 3 weeks or something. I would go and stay with friends in Seattle or Portland, and I would give several weeks of classes so that we could really draw people together. So I was there for several weeks, and for like 10 days or so, they came to everything that I was doing, and they were so enthusiastic, and they bought books that I was selling and, began to read. And then early one morning, they telephoned and they said they absolutely had to come over and see me because they were extremely concerned. And they had bought Master's Whispers from Eternity, which is this wonderful book of answered prayers, and it's very poetic. And somewhere in there they had found a line that said something like, save me from the folly of sex temptation. And all of a sudden they wanted to know if that's what I was really teaching. And they were just totally alarmed by the implications of that one line. And I tried to give them a balanced picture, but I actually never saw them again. So this is what happens to us, is that we think that we're going to be able to do everything that we've always wanted to do in the way that we've always wanted to do it and just call it spiritual. And there's a certain philosophical justification for that. Everything is divine. We are children of God. We are loved just the way we are. So when the thought actually comes, when the realization actually comes that we might actually have to reconsider some of our priorities, and that we might actually have to exert energy in another direction than the automatic flow. This is a line in the sand. However, and sexuality is one of the places where a lot of people crash on the rocks, because it's a very compelling human force, and the yogis do not endorse it with the same enthusiasm that our culture endorses it at this point. So the thought has to be considered that not necessarily that I need immediately or today or tomorrow to become something that is not natural to me, but we also have to be willing to just look at what this teaching actually is. And here he says, that is steadfast in his vow of brahmacharya. But the way Swami writes about it here is the way we have to think about every aspect of yoga practice, which is everything is directional. And we're going to come pretty soon to the verses that are suggesting that moderation is the fastest way to achieve God realization, which is where we may think that the more radical and the more violently we take ourselves in hand, the more effective we will be. But the true teaching of yoga, that's not true. We have to look in the direction where we're trying to go. And what we're talking about is that sexuality is, it spoils our judgment. It uses a tremendous amount of physical energy. It takes energy from the body, and it focuses ourselves into gender identification, into pleasure as the purpose of life. Desires are there to be fulfilled. It wraps us up in a whole external world. And sooner or later we have to understand sort of how the internal and the external world balance together. So Krishna just tells us here we have to be ready when it is an appropriate turn for us to think about this as a discipline. Swami also, let me think how to say it. Master taught so many different things. And there's the science of Raja Yoga, is all of these truths. And the art of Raja Yoga is to know what is appropriate for me to do. Swami was asked once, how much discipline is enough discipline? He said, that which is natural to you that you can do joyfully. And And that's the answer. It's not like, oh, I have to do this, I have to do that. Even if you find that any kind of a discipline, and some people will think about celibacy as a discipline they want, others will think about not sleeping so much, others will think about dietary things that they have to do, or a kind of fierce discipline to meditate or do yoga postures or do this or that. But it's what you can do naturally and joyfully. That's what's good for you. And we should always be stretching ourselves, but we have to stretch ourselves in a direction that makes us feel freer and lighter, not more and more tense and compelled. In the long-standing Catholic monastic tradition, they have a concept called over-scrupulosity. And because they've been at this a long time, they understand that. Over-scrupulosity is where one begins to feel essentially that the spiritual path is your enemy. Because any inclination you have of your own, you must quell it. You just must. I myself started falling into an attitude like that. I remember Swami just pleading with me is the word that I want to use. He said to me, God does not want you to be unhappy. He said, that's your imposition on things. And it's just, and I could see it. You make the path more and more narrow. I can't do this, I can't do that, I can't do this, I can't do that. And finally you just blow off of the spiritual path, actually. Because you've made it so narrow you can't walk it. Or you strain your mind to the point where what you're doing is no longer natural and joyful. So these are, he said, when you're losing your joy and when you feel like the word I use is natural, but what you're doing is just so alien to your own inclinations, then you have to back up. You don't say that kind of discipline, that kind of self-sacrifice, that kind of purification. You don't say that it's not a good thing or a desirable thing or even something in your future, but it's not the color of pigment you should be using now. So the art, one of the many subtleties of being successful on the spiritual path is don't try to make yourself feel better by pulling the top of the mountain closer to where you're standing. You have to be able to stand and you have to look at Everest and you have to know that I'm going to climb to the top of that mountain. But today I first have to cross this hill. Then I have to walk through this valley. Then I have to go over that hill. But Everest is still there. So it's not like this is a wrong teaching. It's just not for me today. I need other experiences that will teach me, that will then make this natural to me. Mahatma Gandhi had the expression, he said, you should never give up a pleasure until you have replaced it with a higher pleasure, is how he put it. And that's a perfect way to say it. It's like when we progress in a natural way, it's like I might take a tiny bit of effort, but still it's just like I'm not inclined that way. And vairagya has come in. I have a disinclination for that because I've been developing myself in all these ways and I've been shifting my vrittis. And so that which I was really eager to do, I'm not so eager to do anymore. And in the field of sexuality, which is where we started with this, or in all kinds of sensual experiences, there's matters of degree. One can be licentious, one can be promiscuous, one can be faithful, one can be moderate, one can be avid. There's just all these different degrees of it, which depending on who you are, where you've been in your life, who you've been in past incarnations, what other disciplines you're facing, what seems appropriate. I remember a friend of mine was going through a certain period, and I had a thought of what might be good for them. But the friend said to me quite simply, I think you're right. He said, but it's not my present priority. And I thought, well, that was a very good answer, because they knew that in their future they were going to have to face what I was suggesting, but not now. Just wasn't good for them now. So see, part of this, and this is essential on the spiritual path, you have to become comfortable. You have to become realistic about your own reality, and you have to become comfortable with that. You can't be in some kind of a competition with some imaginary perfect self that you're trying to be. You have to just see things as they're honest. And there's an example of keeping the mountain where it is. A friend of mine was very deeply hurt by someone else, just felt quite betrayed and misunderstood and was suffering a lot from that realization. And in an effort to make themselves feel better, they came to Swami and they said, they sort of brought up this, a true spiritual principle, but it's a little bit of a pop psychology principle too. Everything happens just the way it's supposed to happen. Everybody behaves perfectly. Which, you can stretch that philosophically, but it also, at a certain point, departs from common sense. And this is what my friend went to Swami and said, so-and-so, they just behaved perfectly. They did just what they were supposed to do. Swami said, no, they didn't. They behaved very badly, just like that. He said, don't comfort yourself with something that isn't true. Don't try to make yourself better by telling yourself a lie. He said that person that you trusted behaved very badly. And that's what happened. You have to transcend it for what it was. You can't shift it into something else. And see, this is related to let's bring the mountain down to where I feel more comfortable. If I just change the nature of reality, then look, I'm just fine. There was a spiritual, and I use the little word in quotes, air quotes there. There was a very popular spiritual teacher through the 70s, 80s, maybe even a little beyond that. And they were enormously popular. They had thousands of followers. And the basic philosophy was, just do whatever you want, but just call it spiritual. In fact, the more you do of what you want, the more spiritual you are. It was just a stupid teaching. But it was presented with a great deal of veneer of validity, and people loved it. Of course they loved it. And you can stretch the philosophy to say that, but it defies common sense, and it's contrary to all orthodoxy. So that's what we want to work with. So now Swami says, Krishna says, chapter 6, verse 15. The self-governed yogi, his mind fully controlled, attains the peace of supreme nirvana, the state of individual extinction in union with my spirit, with the divine spirit. See, here we have self-purification, he says back here. Here he uses the phrase self-governed. These words are also really important words. The practice of yoga is not an institutional religion. It's not even a religion at all. Religion is like an organized entity that the masters come and they have a direct experience of infinity. It's a revelation. And through the power of that revelation, they inspire people. And words get written down that are the fruit of that direct revelation. And then other individuals become devoted to the master, which is appropriate, and they begin to study the words, or they have inner contact or external contact, and they don't have the same revelation. We don't have the same revelation, but we get some of it. And then we begin to codify it. We begin to organize it. We begin to develop rituals around it. We develop images around it, symbols. All of this is to the good. This is the way the cosmos runs. But a religion is not the same as a revelation. And then, especially through Kali Yuga descending, which is where we've been, even Kali Yuga rising, these religions begin to get a life of their own. And the religion gets farther and farther away from the revelation, and the religion becomes what it is that people follow. They're not necessarily following the revelation at all. They're just following the religion. And this is when you have to belong to this certain church to be saved, or you have to do these certain rituals to be saved. And then the religion starts trying to answer all these questions. I grew up Jewish and with a very light touch of spirituality. Actually, I would say virtually none. But very ethical, very, very moral family, and very strong. I mean, the Judaism is a religion, and it's also a whole way of approaching life, which has a lot of integrity to it. And it was the integrity side of Judaism that was really given to me. But I didn't know much about anything else about it. I have a lot of friends who are Catholic, and when you grow up in the Catholic world, and especially if you're trained from childhood, you have all these catechisms and all these things that you can say. And sometimes when my now self-realizationist friends who grew up in these very Catholic ways, they just start reciting these dogmas and these rules and the way things are, just one after another. And it's just so startling to me, because once you start organizing the religion, you have to start answering lots of questions. And once you start telling people what they have to do to be saved, you also have to tell them what will cause them to be damned. That's what I was trying to say. Because once you're saved, then you also have the alternative, which is you're not saved. And then you have to start, as Swami said, because the natural human tendency is to want to know, what's the bottom line? Like, how little do I have to do in order to be saved? Or how many transgressions can I commit before I've crossed the line into being damned? And once your institution takes on, the definition of what will save you and what will cause you to be damned, they have to keep answering those questions. How many times can you miss Mass? How many times can you do this sin? How completely, can you be exonerated for what you did? It just, from the outside, it becomes crazy. And so when you go back to the scripture, he uses words like self-governed. And this has nothing to do with any religious dogmas or any rules. When Jesus was incarnated, and the whole context of Jesus' life took place in the Jewish culture. Jesus himself, what it actually was, in fact, was there were three essential branches of Judaism at that time. There was the Sadducees and the Pharisees. The Pharisees were the strongest force, and then there were the Essenes. And increasingly, as time has gone by, even, just mainstream historical study of the life of Jesus includes the Essenes. And when you go into, the things that Master writes and other more esoteric sources, the Essenes were the ones who were holding the true revelations of Judaism. And the Pharisees and the Sadducees were the ones who were holding the public power. They were running the temple, they were the religion, and the Essenes were keeping the revelation. And Jesus was born into that Essene community. This is what I've come to understand from reading this a lot, and from things that Master said and Swami said. And so the whole context was the revelation of Moses, who was a great master, a great avatar, being renewed by Jesus, reminding a segment of the Jewish people that this is what Judaism really is, and then crashing up against the religion. And the religion was rules and guidelines, and this is how you're saved, and this is how you're not saved. This is how you please God, and this is how you don't. And Jesus was trying to bring the self-governing aspect of it. It's not all these rules that you follow, it's who you are. And if you read the Bible from that point of view, he's just arguing, he's arguing with the corrupt priesthood. Even to call it Judaism, it's not any particular religion. It's revelation and a powerful priesthood, which is undermined by direct revelation, because direct revelation puts spiritual responsibility in the hands of the individual. And it completely disempowers the institution because it's self-purification by the techniques your guru teaches you. It's not going to the church and following their rules. And we're self-governed. We meditate because we choose to meditate. And when we meditate, there's no religion. It's just the spiritual eye. It's if thy two eyes be single, thy whole body will be full of light. That's what Jesus said. And a man is condemned, he said, not for whether he follows the dietary rules, not by the food that comes into his mouth, but by the spirit of the words that comes out, by the purity of his heart, not by the purity of his stomach, is actually also how Master put it. It's in talking about those parts of the Bible. So when Krishna just says, the self-governed yogi. And see, this is very important for us because we gather together. Ananda is an entity, and there are other ashrams and entities where individuals of like-minded spirit and like practice gather together. Because especially, as Swamiji writes in The Path, when he's talking about the need for communities, in this age, where the values of the age are so antithetical to the values of the self-governed yogi, it's very difficult to maintain a commitment to true, serious spiritual practice when everything in the world around us just is inviting us to do exactly the opposite. And not passively, but aggressively. Just even, I was having breakfast out with some friends of mine a couple of days ago, and very nice little restaurant, not very far from where I live, with a lovely outdoor patio. It's an extremely pleasant place. The food is very good. But just in the background, and we asked them to turn it down a little bit, this really awful music is playing. And it's not even really music. It's just kind of an assault on your nervous system. Really, if anybody with any sensitivity is listening, why would you want to sit there, even when you're taking food in, and are therefore especially receptive, with just this cacophonous noise? Fortunately, it was pushed far enough to the background, and I'm no longer the policeman for the entire world when it comes to awful music. But it was just so interesting to me, like, here we are, and our magnetism was stronger than that music, so I mean, it was tolerable. Otherwise, in this world, you can't even go out. But there it is. In this world, you can't even go out because it's constantly assaulting you. I fought for years with the YMCA, where I go to use their wonderful swimming pool, because they started bringing music into an indoor pool. You know what the acoustics are like in an indoor swimming pool? And then they put on this cacophonous noise. It's like, how can you not notice how dissonant this is to a calm spirit? But now I just have very good earplugs because apparently they don't notice. So therefore, it's very important that those of us who are like-minded, we band together because we need each other. We need to support each other. We need to clarify what the path is. We need to give each other a safe haven where the vibrations are nurturing and we can speak our hearts without being misunderstood. So it's not as if absolute solitude is better. We are greatly gifted when we can have satsang with fellow truth seekers. Satsang is one of the most important things on the spiritual path. Master said environment is stronger than willpower. So you want to create an environment in which your spiritual aspirations are nurtured. I mean, I thank God every day for my spiritual family. But your spiritual family, we're helping each other to follow the revelation. It's not like by being just part of it that automatically makes you good. Garrison Keillor, the American humorist, said to imagine that sitting in church will make you a Christian is like going into your garage and waiting to become an automobile. That's how he put it, which was just so absolutely perfect. We're either self-governed, we're either self-purifying by the techniques our guru gave us, or we're not. And this is, on one hand, it places a lot of responsibility on the individual. You can't just automatically make your way through and end up at the top of the mountain. You have to commit yourself. And this is also the wonderful good news, that the entire project is in our hands. And this goes back to what I was saying earlier about, yes, these are the rules, these are the things that we're going to have to do eventually, but I'm self-governed. I don't have to do it just your way because you said. I'm self-governed. I can say, this is the right step for me. This is the right step for me. This is the right step for me. And each of us has our own personal relationship with God, which also means no one can interfere with it. No one can excommunicate you. No one can say that you're going to have to go to hell or not go to hell. Nobody knows. No one knows but you, God, and your guru. That's all. And that relationship is completely your own. So when he talks here about attains the peace of supreme nirvana, of individual extinction in union with my spirit, Swamiji writes here, as he's written in several places, that nirvana is somewhat misdefined and as somehow that individuality, that we go unconscious, that our consciousness is snuffed out. What it actually means, Swami says, is that our separate individuality is merged into the ocean. Swami describes it as it's the drop of water, which is our individual consciousness, the jiva, which is that drop of water in the great ocean of spirit. Because the jiva is identified with the bodies, the causal, the astral, and the physical, the way Master tries to describe it is, it's like there are these glass bottles, and the drop, that is ourself, is enclosed within these three, the physical body, the astral body, and the causal body. So mere physical death does not liberate us from our identification with separate individuality. The bottle of the physical body can break, and then we have our astral individuality. And for a long time in the process of spiritual evolution, we move back and forth between the material and the astral, between the energy and the material world. And so we live in the astral world for a while, then we incarnate and take a physical body, and we identify with that and live through its cycle. Then we lose that body and we go back to the astral. At a certain point, we're finished with the necessity to have a physical body. There's no more inclinations within us that require the material world to express. And then we live in the astral world, and we learn whatever those lessons are, and beyond my perceived experience, but this is how I understand it. Then we can transcend that. We're in the causal world, and then we transcend that. Then the bubble is in the ocean. But the bubble's still there because the ocean is still made of all these individual bubbles. But the bubble is no longer has a limited sheath around it. So the bubble feels itself to be a part of the whole ocean. So this is what, as Swami explains it, this is what Krishna is saying. We no longer see ourselves as separate. But the individuality, the masters tell us, is there forever. And this is why Jesus can manifest to his disciples, and it really is Jesus. Or your grandmother can appear to you in a dream, although she's probably reincarnated by this point. But whatever individuality was ever in existence can always be remanifested. But even as manifested, it doesn't bind the jiva as it did. It's waves on the ocean, is how Swami also says it. No image is perfectly clear, but you can see a wave that looks very individualized. But when you look at it, you realize that, but it's just nothing but an expression of the ocean. There's no point at which this wave has become anything separate from the ocean. But it appears to be separate. But when you understand it more closely, you just see it's just an expression of the infinite. And this is what comes to us. And then, as Swami described himself, he said, I never identify with Swami Kriyananda. Swami Kriyananda is an event for which I am responsible. So one could identify with the whole ocean, but realize that this is the wave that I have to keep following. Or as I was saying earlier, that these are the atoms that I have to keep together in order to keep this body moving. Isn't it a wonderful? It's just, these are images that the rational, ordinary self can't really grasp. But when we meditate and when we draw deep within ourselves, they're marvelous images just to explore with our imagination. What would it feel like? Who would I be if I could really just watch myself and realize that I'm just responsible for this event? But I identify with the whole ocean, even though this is the particular wave I'm riding. Then the words of the scripture and the consciousness of the masters and our entry into that divine world, then those doors begin to open. God bless you, my friend.